thing. Perfect. And I want to welcome everybody to this session of our Wikistrat webinar. Today we are having Mr. Eric Chan, who is one of the top leading experts on China and the whole entire topic of cross-strait relations. Maybe that should be what we should call it, or maybe Eric will correct me soon. And today's webinar is following the event, or I would say the elections outcome from a few weeks ago, where I'm sure there is a lot to be discussed and to share with us. So at this point, I would like to welcome you, Eric, and everybody on board to this webinar. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Oren. Kind introduction. I'm Eric Chan, member of the Global Taiwan Institute. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the recent Taiwan elections, implications on the cross-strait relationship, and of course, the broader relationship it has for the globe, also with the US and a PRC relationship as well. So let's go to the next slide.
So, Eric, maybe we'll start with you providing us, which is with this slide, if you can provide us with a short overview of the outcome of the elections and their meaning and implications. The floor is yours.
Perfect. All right, so, basic introduction. As with a lot of things Taiwan, you're really talking about a lot of paradoxes associated with this election, right? It's the first big election in a year that's going to be full of consequential elections. 3 major candidates at one time, and even 4, right? And these candidates use words like peace and war, deterrence and preparation for war. But the funny thing is that the biggest practical differences among all of them weren't even in foreign policy. And the majority of the Taiwan population were more concerned about domestic economic aspects versus things like foreign policy, relationship with China, and peace and war. Yes, all very important, but that's also secondary to the economic slowdown that Taiwan is currently suffering from, right? But first, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why this election is important, right? First, the winner of this election is going to be dealing with what us as PRC defense specialists consider to be the decade of maximum danger from the threat of an outright PRC invasion, right? Second, and that's related to the first, is that the internal messaging and dynamics of this election, as reflected back onto the Chinese Communist Party, all these internal dynamics still unknown. And we don't know what the overall effect this will have on paramount leader Xi Jinping. And then third, what are the effects of this election on domestic Taiwan politics? That's also a complete scramble right now. All right, so let's go over some of the basics of what we do know, right? You see here the 3 major candidates, Lai Ching-te of the nominally pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party. Then you see Hou You-yi of the pro-China engagement Kuomintang, or the nationalists. And then finally, Ko Wen-je of the self-proclaimed centrist Taiwan People's Party. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these results, right? Lai here obviously won a resounding plurality, but it was also equally as obvious that if Ho and Ko had managed to work together, then Lai would have also been equally resoundingly been defeated, right? And this is a really big shift from the dynamics of even 4 years ago. Next slide, please. Right, so with this slide, we can see some of the overall historical background, the vote share in the recent elections, right? The current Taiwan president, Tsai Ing-wen, starting in 2016, pretty much almost single-handedly unified the Democratic Progressive Party, brought it out of a decade of weakness against the KMT. And Lai just doesn't have the same type of rock star quality, right? And it really shows in this election, right? Lai is a workhorse candidate. He was famous for his eloquent speeches for Taiwan independence and also for his role in democratizing Taiwan. But he's sort of handcuffed by the legacy of the very moderate and centrist Tsai, right? Tsai very much tried to engage with the CCP. She also made it very clear to the United States and also to the global community that she was trying to make Taiwan a beacon of stability. And this was something that Taiwan's international partners liked. It was something that the Taiwan domestic populace really liked. So Lai really couldn't differentiate himself very much from Tsai's policy here. The big problem is that Lai in the past has had a reputation for pushing more on the independence portion. So he was a little bit handcuffed and everybody knew it, and he couldn't really be very true to himself. So that explains a little bit of his unpopularity. Of course, there's also an issue of voter fatigue with the DPP after 2 successful terms, the current economic downturn. So we see a lot of voter defection among the younger voters from the DPP to the TPP. And then, as you can see here, though, unfortunately for the KMT, because they're so paralyzed inside their own party, and because they're just not a very popular party to start with, they just simply couldn't capitalize on Lai's weakness as a candidate. So it's very revealing in that even though Lai is weak as a candidate, KMT party weakness is even more so. So this is what is really affecting the balance of power between the KMT and the DPP. Next slide. All right, so here's another way to interpret this, right? Here's the recent Paula Paul's development up until the Paul's blackout in early January, right? Interesting date from this period is a period from November 15th to the 25th. So the KMT and the TPP were deep in talks for a unity ticket. Independent Terry Go was also showing interest in joining up for this unity ticket as well. So Terry Go, famously the billionaire that owns founder of Foxconn Electronics Manufacturing, seen as even more China-friendly than the KMT. And in fact, Terry himself used to be KMT. So such a unified pan-blue ticket, as it's called, would have definitely been enough to overcome the DPP given the voter fatigue. But this completely fell apart on November 23 due to personal issues, right? Whether Ho or Ko was going to lead that unity ticket. And it fell apart really, really spectacularly, right? It fell apart on live camera with Ho, Ko, and Go all arguing with each other on camera with the KMT grandees standing very, very uncomfortably in the background. So this, of course, led to a complete meltdown of the relationship between Ho and Ko, and that has significant implications on the politics of today. Okay, next slide. And again, concurrent with the Taiwan presidential elections, the elections with the legislature, right? And in this case, the KMT did manage to capitalize a little bit on this type of voter fatigue. They won a very, very small majority in the legislative yuan. But of course, it wasn't enough for them to actually fully take the reins of power, right? So this leaves the TPP as the proverbial kingmakers. And this is where the poisoned bad blood between Ho and Ko really come into play, right? Not only do they have to be able to overcome these differences, because the DPP still holds the executive yuan, that means that they have more goodies to be able to offer if the TPP were to work with the DPP instead. So this puts the KMT in a really bad spot, right? And this will probably worsen the internal dynamics with the KMT, which has already been really bad over the last few years, right? The KMT right now split into 3 different factions, really. You have the first, a very pro-China engagement faction. You have a pro-US engagement faction that's trying to remake the KMT. And then you have a faction that's trying to be the moderating influence among the other 2 factions. And between the three of them, it's really hard to see where the KMT is going to go, right? And some of this disunity was already seen just right in a prior, just in this election itself, right? Just a few days before the election itself, former Taiwan president and KMT member Ma Ying-jeou said comments like, Taiwan could never win against the PRC because the PRC is too large. They're so much stronger than Taiwan. And that made the KMT candidates, they had to pretty much disassociate themselves from that pivotal figure within the KMT and disinvite Ma to a number of events. So this sort of pretends another round of intra-party squabbling. The squabbling pretty much consumed the KMT from 2016 to 2020. And then in 2020, with a very, very bad defeat of the KMT then under Han Kuo-yu, this also led to another round of squabbling. Just to make things more fun, Han Kuo-yu has now been nominated as the KMT speaker in the legislature going forward. So we're going to see another enlarged round of inter-party squabbling as time goes forward. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so now we can look at the cross-strait policies of the three candidates. Interestingly enough, again, not all that different. The funny thing is that it just pretty much focuses on something called the 1992 consensus, which is agreed upon famously by the KMT and the CCP back in 1992 before true democratization of Taiwan. Yet the funny thing is that the KMT interpretation of the 1992 consensus is different from the CCP's definition. So even the word consensus is not even so much a consensus. So that's the irony of it, is that the biggest difference between all the cross-strait policies focuses on a consensus that does not really even exist in reality. So it's a lot of talk. Under Tsai, she made a number of outreach attempts with the CCP. The CCP rebuffed them all just simply because of the DPP's history as a pro-independence party. A lot of Ho Youi's discussion was that he was going to conduct outreach with the party and with China to see if that could calm down the waters. The KMT messaging for the US was that they were going to do this type of discussion to buy Taiwan time to build its own military deterrence. Of course, to China, it was simply that, they were going to foster party-to-party discussions, as well as, because they couldn't consider themselves a country-to-country discussion, but that they were going to focus it on a party discussion. Ko Wen-je was really stuck in the middle. He was trying to find a middle ground, saying that he was open to discussion, but it didn't really come with any specifics. So it was very much like Ko's other policies, where he tried to triangulate between the policies, didn't really have much to say for himself. Okay, next slide. Defense and, go back. Back to the defense and foreign policies. Yep, perfect. Again, you can see here the differences between all the candidates here for defense and foreign policy. Pretty minimal, right? Everybody was on board with enlarging the Taiwan's defense budget, which has gone up significantly under Tsai Ing-wen, probably some 40–50%. They're all in favor of increased military training, the conscription period. There's already been some backsliding with talk by Ko, as well as talk by Ho, about is that 1 year period of conscription really necessary? Can we achieve the same effects if we just increase the quality of training versus length of training, knowing that this was previously a third rail of Taiwan politics, right? Tsai made a very brave decision to try to move this conscription period longer, And with a backlash, the fears that were sparked with the Russia-Ukraine invasion, there was rare public agreement back then that the conscription period of 4 months really needed to be, reversed back to a 1 year period. So that's starting right now. Right, but there's already signs of a little bit of backsliding by the other opposing parties, right? But other than that, the policies not really different. They're really boxed in, as it were, by the CCP on one end, as well as expectations from the United States on the other, as well as their own domestic fears that whatever it is that they're doing possibly isn't enough to really increase deterrence, right? So again, the irony of this election, everybody talking defense and how it was going to be a choice between peace and war, yet these differences were not very great. And now, especially with the split government, what we're going to see is likely a lot of the low reaching through, right? Things that can be done without really big expansions or really big use of legislative powers, things that the Ministry of National Defense can do for itself, such as training improvement, things such as that all the parties agree on, such as increasing the defense budget. Even there's some limitations. The defense budget might increase, but unfortunately, with defense industrial backlogs, issues with the supply chains, like everything else in the world of today, there's going to be some serious issues of moving the new items that Taiwan is buying into Taiwan itself. And that's going to be an issue for the next 2 or 3 years at least. Okay, next slide. All right, so now we can talk a little bit about what the party is going to do, right? And this is showing how the party has treated Taiwan just prior to these elections, right? Very clear that the PLA were under orders just prior to the elections to keep their incursions relatively low, right? There was that big spike when Nancy Pelosi, the then U.S. House Speaker, visited Taiwan back in 2022. But then since then, they've been keeping a relatively low pace, knowing that doing so would cause a backlash against the KMT. So instead, what the PLA has been doing is looking at new novel ways of messaging their coercion, right? Starting in January, a much more heavy use of balloons, right? Just on 21 January, the PLA sent some 6 balloons, pretty much bisecting Taiwan from the north and from the south, just to show that they could encircle Taiwan symbolically, right? So incursions will probably ramp up as well, but I don't foresee a really large increase in those type of incursions until May, because the party is trying to keep this as a messaging mechanism, just to see what Lai Ching-te's inauguration speech will be like in May 20th, right? Discussions, things of state-to-state relations, completely forbidden, so-called by the party. If those type of words are mentioned by Lai, then you can really see a huge uptick. Regardless, we'll probably also see more large-scale exercises, practicing some sort of shrouding of Taiwan, the feared Taiwan blockade scenario. Economically, we've already seen a shot across the bow from the PRC. There's an economic cooperation framework agreement that was agreed on by the KMT some years back with preferential tariffs from China. And back in December, China revised 12 of these preferential tariffs on relatively minor goods or petrochemical products, which Taiwan isn't exactly big on, right? But just to show that these type of things, are on the table. So those probably will be targeted again in a ramping way again by the PRC, right? Especially against Taiwan farmers and fishers, because that is the the DPP support base, right? And then finally, with foreign policy, we've already seen some of it. Just back in January 15th. We've seen the PRC poach the Pacific Island nation of Nauru to switch recognition from Republic of China, Taiwan to the PRC. So we'll probably see another ramp up of that also in May. But this is really masking a period of pretty significant weakness by the CCP and by the PRC writ large, right? Economically, the PRC is suffering from a pretty bad downturn that's probably going to worsen in the short term. So this is what's really driving Xi's internal dynamics right now. Xi's visit over to the U.S. Really trying to drum up U.S. foreign investment and by extension, Western foreign investment, knowing that this type of foreign investment is critical to keeping the Chinese economy going, especially because Xi has been very strict about trying to keep some of what he terms reforms, the national securitization of everything reform going. Right. So this is the one thing that's allowing him to, continue providing money for other weaknesses in the PRC economy, like the provincial governments, or like the real estate crisis, or like the restructuring of the PRC economy. So the party is in a tight spot. She knows it. And it's not something that Taiwan can really take advantage of, so to say, because there is a huge power difference. But Taiwan can probably rest easy for this year, knowing that while there is going to be a spike in military incursions and gray zone activity, an invasion is probably not going to be likely. A serious crisis is probably not going to be likely in 2024 or 2025 for that matter. Okay, so with that, I end my official presentation, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I think the first question that we have received also when we basically launched this webinar for registration was about the actual implication of US elections and how a scenario of either Trump, if he's going to be the candidate, which looks like, or Biden winning, will impact this triangle relations between China, Taiwan, and the U.S. So you mentioned that this is the first out of many elections that we're going to have this year with significant meaning. So this is probably the one which will also have one. So how do you see the U.S. election playing into this triangle relations?
Yes, of course, very pivotal. Biden himself has been very, very publicly supportive of Taiwan, right? Making a whole bunch of quote off the cuff remarks that everybody sort of knows were not that off the cuff, right? And of course, Trump is very volcanic and mercurial in nature. I think he's made a number of comments denigrating Taiwan. Yet under his previous administration, the people under him were also very famously pro-Taiwan. So we have a sort of a strange situation where there's bipartisan agreement that there has to be a lot more ramped up U.S. support for Taiwan. If anything, Republican support for Taiwan has been even greater than Democratic support for Taiwan. If nothing else, as to use Taiwan as a stick to beat China over with, which is, not ideal from at least my own personal perspective. So we have a sort of a strange situation where, yes, we've seen candidate Trump make a number of, off-the-cuff comments about Taiwan, yet we have an overall, U.S. party and election structure that sort of emphasizes competition with China and emphasizes the importance of keeping Taiwan free. So my own sense is that this type of bipartisan accord will probably overwhelm any of the particulars that either the candidates might say on the campaign trail. U.S. support for Taiwan will probably remain robust simply because of this type of competition aspect, as well as the fact that simply put, right now the U.S. is actually enjoying a period of strength against the PRC, given the U.S.'s quite amazing economic growth versus the PRC's economic downturn. So there's very few carrots that China could offer, or even is willing to offer the U.S. at this time. And then simply the U.S. will not really offer much carrots other than this type of, you know, sort of the standard reassurance that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence, whatever that means, right? So relatively little impact, I would say.
And staying on the point of foreign relations, or I would say the triangular relations, I would like to take it from the actor of the US, Taiwan, and China to the one of Japan. Do you see any potential that this outcome of the elections will have an impact on Taiwan's relations with Japan, or how will China will be basically impacted? The Japanese-Chinese relations will be impacted by the Taiwanese election in any way or form?
I think the best way to put it is that the Japanese politics has always been a little bit more comfortable working with the DPP as opposed to the KMT. Well, first, Japan's relatively modern and more muscular foreign policy has sort of been conducted not hand in hand with the DPP per se, but rather side by side with the DPP, right? So the continuation of DPP foreign policy is something that Japan will be more comfortable with, right? They're not going to be working with the KMT. They won't have to work with a new set of foreign policy and defense officials. They can continue, their quiet discussions that have been ongoing. Japan will, have a little bit more leeway to conduct its more muscular foreign policy, even if that foreign policy right now is a little bit more talk than actual action, just given the speed by which the Japanese bureaucracy runs, right? So this type of thing is probably more comfortable for all the parties involved. We're probably going to see continued Japanese and Taiwan discussions about potential scenarios. I think that's how they phrase it, is investigation of scenarios, and continued discussion for the very nascent type of Japan Taiwan defense cooperation.
And from the perspective of Taiwan's and the internal calls that it has within for unification with China, one of the questions we received here is did Mang Yinju's, I hope I'm not too bad in pronouncing the
No
name,
worries.
uh, of his comments of advocating for unification had a significant impact on the voting outcome.
I couldn't say that it was significant because much of the party shares you saw with some of the slides before pretty much were baked in since the class of the discussions back in November. But what it did do was probably get some of the independents that were undecided to probably go actually the way of the DPP, right? So this is a lot of inter-party squabbling that was just put onto display, right? Even if it wasn't even so much a messaging itself, a lot of the internal Taiwan dynamics was so much that if the KMT couldn't even decide, what type of foreign policy it wanted among itself, how could it very much, negotiate with the CCP, right? How could it even have discussions that would necessarily need some sort of buy-in from the DPP as well as the TPP? So again, serious issues put on display about the KMT competence in dealing with its own issues.
Is there any form, or I would say any type of actions that China can make in order to convince the public in Taiwan, or at least appeal for the public in Taiwan, that reunification is something that they would be considering in a positive way?
There probably would be, but Xi Jinping is not the person that to do it, right? She has never been one to really offer carrots. And his interpretation of carrots has always been to throw money at a problem. And that's not very persuasive for the Taiwan populace, right? Even in the case of Hong Kong, that was probably the biggest sticking point, right? Hong Kong had an agreement with the CCP that their system would remain untouched. Yet after some of the protests that we saw the PRC heavy use of the stick, and even more troubling from a Taiwanese perspective was that PRC internal media essentially trumpeted this, right? They didn't try to play it down. They didn't try to quiet it up. Instead, what they like to say was that this was the party imposing needed discipline on Hong Kong, and that the project of moving the two sides together had actually been sped up by the party's resolute actions, quote unquote. Right. So as it was not even so much what she said, but as the response by the party itself, by the populace itself, to what happened in Hong Kong, that was a real serious driver of Taiwanese domestic views about the PRC, right? So they know that very few carrots that she could give them, and that even if she were to offer carrots, these are the type of things that can be withdrawn at any time. And the PRC use of economic coercion, such as revising and agreed upon things such as ECFA, the cooperation agreement, really just plays to those fears. So yeah, very few carrots. I don't foresee Xi really trying to use those carrots either. To the extent that we do see some of that, the party will probably try a little bit of what it calls united front efforts against the TPP as well as the KMT, looking at how they can support the KMT and maybe the TPP to work a little bit closer together to try to stymie some of the DPP's efforts, maybe throw sand in the gears of Taiwan defense reform. But other than these relatively tactical movements, I can't really see any big strategic changes in policy by Xi Jinping.
So you went a little bit ahead of the curve there with the topic of Hong Kong, because that was the next question I wanted to ask you, in terms of how much did the events of the demonstrations in Hong Kong and being suppressed by China and what followed afterwards, how much did that impact the voting in these Taiwanese elections? I mean, it did happen quite a while ago, but still there was one
Yes.
time difference between one elections to the other that is happening in between. So how much was that of a topic or of an impact on the Taiwanese elections outcome?
Right. So yes, it happened a while ago, but the stream of essentially refugees from Hong Kong lasted for a few years after the event. So there's been quite a lot of discussion too in Taiwan itself about the legacy of Hong Kong. Of course, famously, what happened in Hong Kong essentially saved Tsai Ing-wen back in 2020, gave her landslide victory. But even now, the echoes of that, have continued to give Lai that edge he really needed against, the Pan Blue coalition, right? And then, of course, even more so, Russia and Ukraine, because what that showed was that the decisions of any one person just aren't predictable, right? The discussions before by a lot of the general populace in Taiwan was that surely an armed invasion by China wasn't going to happen because there's so many institutional blockages to such an action inside the party, the CCP itself. But I think as Putin shows that once you have an authoritarian leader, he probably has enough levers and powers to really remove those institutional blocks and do what he really wants to do. So she's already made it very clear that he wants Taiwan in one shape, in one way or another. So that really has galvanized the population, always kept it on the back burner. So what we've seen in the election is pretty much, I would say, a bottom line for all the parties, right? This is pretty much the worst type of results that the DPP can get under an inspirational candidate, right? So that if given a better candidate, such as actually Li's own vice president, Xiaobi Kim, she's a lot more outgoing, a lot more popular. Actually, the DPP might actually have, a good, a relatively easier future as opposed to the KMT.
And looking into a little bit from Taiwanese internal politics into Chinese, and there was the entire, I would say, let's call it consolidation of power by Xi in the 20th Party Congress that took over last year. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see that playing into the cross-strait relations between China and Taiwan?
Right. So that consolidation of power, if anything, is a little bit backfiring on Xi right now because Xi really doesn't have any useful patsies left over to blame, right? Other than his own underlings. Previously, there was enough of the other factions in power, not really in power, that he could always, sort of brush aside some of the bad news onto them. But now with the likes of Li Keqiang gone, right? Now she doesn't really have that type of easy way out. And that also has its own impact on Taiwan politics itself. One of the reasons for KMT weakness in these elections was that the KMT really couldn't say that they had a really good partner to discuss with other than Xi. And Xi is extremely unpopular in Taiwan. Right before the KMT could simply say, "Hey, look, we're talking to these lower level officials within the CCP, not Xi himself, but these lower level officials who are interested in economic development and foreign investment, maybe working together." And now that's a lot harder for them to make that case that there's these type of lower level officials interested in economic growth, because what we've seen Xi do is to actually go down into the lower levels and make economic decisions, telling provincial party officials what they can do and what they can't do. So the KMT doesn't have a real partner for dialogue anymore, even at the lower levels, and the Taiwan populace knows it. So like really weakens a KMT power.
And moving from the politics in China to the economics, obviously China is going through a rough economic period right now. How is that, if anything, is impacting Taiwan? But not necessarily from the economic perspective. Obviously, the trade is suffering, but from the political perspective.
Right. So from the political perspective, this pretty much gives the DPP a little bit of breathing room because even while China is trying to put the screws on Taiwan economically, there's going to be some bottom lines that the PRC will be extremely unwilling to touch, like the trade with semiconductors. And this is something that the DPP knows full well, right? So they're actually in a really comfortable position where they're helping the U.S. with its own semiconductor industry, and so thus has some new measure of leverage with the U.S. as well as with China, especially with the type of semiconductors used in manufacturing. So yes, there's economic coercion by China, but Taiwan also knows pretty well that there's limits to the biggest parts of the market. So the DPP has breathing room, right? It doesn't mean that they're going to declare independence, but it also means that Lai can essentially just continue what his platform is, which is to say, ignore China and continue working with the United States.
And a question we received in the registration forms in coming to this event was about, does the election have any impact on the potential U.S. standing by Taiwan in case of a Chinese military action? Do you see that having any impact at all, the outcome of the elections?
Right. So there's always extremely important structural balance of power issues and interests that the U.S. has in seeing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. But I think the biggest thing for the U.S. is that they have, a set of people that they have been extremely comfortable working with. Shelby Kim, the vice president, will likely be given most of the foreign policy and defense policy portfolios in the Lai administration, simply because Lai himself isn't really well versed in those issues, whereas Xiao was previously representative to the United States, right, and had extremely big bipartisan following. Like there were fans of Xiao in Capitol Hill in the United States. So with Xiao being there, the U.S. is relatively happy in that there's a stable partner that they like. There's people that they're familiar with and that they trust. So regardless of the elections on the U.S. side, Taiwan is a known entity. So they're going to be extremely comfortable being able to continue the defense reforms, to continue some of the cooperation that the U.S. has instituted over the last 4 years, the last 8 years even.
And you have showed in your presentation a graph that shows how after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, there has been a sharp increase immediately after, a sharp increase before and during and after of the Chinese Navy and Air Force in regard to basically incursions to Taiwan space. But do you see, and then it decreased in the upcoming months and years after. Do you see 2024? I think you mentioned that a little bit, but do you see 2024 as a year where we're going to see a spike back to those levels? If, and this is the element I wanted to add, if there is going to be another high level visit of officials, or do you see that something that the Chinese are willing to kind of accept in some way or form?
No, what I think what's going to be likely is that you're going to see a slowly increasing and then ramped up version of these type of incursions, right? Yeah, there was a spike back with the Nancy Pelosi visit, and that also had much to do with the concurrent PLA exercise at that time. But it was also pretty clear that the PLA had been given the resources and the leeway to increase the number of incursions on a new heightened level. So regardless of what Lai says, yes, we're going to see an increased level of incursions. In fact, it's probably going to, the PLA budget will probably be protected, if anything, despite this, the economic downturn in the PRC. We're probably not going to see that type of same, scale of exercises that were conducted post Pelosi visit. That would only be safe if Lai said something truly remarkable, which I really doubt he will do. But yes, we'll probably see an increased new normal, so to speak, of incursions.
Is there a question we received by several of the people we're in contact in regard to the topic of Taiwan? The question is always, is there a moment in which China needs to make a decision when it comes to an invasion? Meaning, is there a time clock, a sand clock, something that many people raise this theory when it comes to Russia and their invasion of Ukraine, as if there was a moment that Putin just had to make that decision, or else it would have been too late. It's a theory that's been running around for a while. Is there such a thing when it comes to Taiwan and China?
Well, I've always disagreed with that, theory of whether things would be too late for Putin or not. There was no driving reason that Putin had to go when he did, right? Just speaking of the Ukraine case, it wasn't like Ukraine was going to join NATO imminently, right? Or even in the next few years, if February 2022 had not happened. And the same thing goes with China. Yes, China specialists, PRC defense specialists, we like to call it, a decade of maximum danger. But that's all it really means is maximum. It just means that, Chinese power is at a maximum level relative to US power, relative to Taiwan power. But it certainly doesn't mean that in 2035, suddenly it would be impossible for China to conduct an invasion, or in 2045, it would be impossible for China to conduct an invasion. That is always, an ongoing threat. So I don't believe that there is a specific timeline. I also don't believe that, there's a time that the PRC must conduct an invasion. But on the other hand, I think there are some real influences on PRC leadership, or what happens to Xi Jinping after he passes. We don't know if the next leader will have that, type of, desire to build a legacy that she clearly has, right? So, not even so much, something that a state has to do. It's much more in the minds of, or what does she feel like he has to do, and that is, of course, unknown.
A while ago, I have seen a very good presentation made by you about the impact of the Arab Spring and how it impacted the decision-making process when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party. Um, and I wanted to ask about the potential of how the war in Ukraine has impacted China and the PRC, specifically the leadership there, when it comes to their decision in regard to the cross-strait relations. Is that any way motivated them in a certain direction? Were there any lessons learned? Were they shocked by gaps of capabilities that was a surprise for them? Uh, Anything that the war in Ukraine has an impact on them from this regard?
Oh, certainly. So yes, there's been a number of military lessons, of course, that the PLA has taken from the war in Ukraine. But even speaking on a bigger level about decision making that goes on, and about the calculus to domestic stability, and that's always a primary consideration by the party. There's a number of good news for Xi and a number of bad news for Xi associated with the invasion, right? The good news first is how broad support there has been for the war within Russian society, right? The war has been very, very badly run by the Russian military in general. Yet even a year or two of very grinding losses by the Russians, the Russian public is by and large lukewarm support. Nothing that would overturn Putin's power. And the Putin's security regime, his security apparatus, it's nothing like the much more intense apparatus that Xi has at his fingertips. So Xi must be a little bit hardened by that. Now, the bad news for Xi is that he's also seen, that when Prigozhin launched his coup, against Putin, or his, whatever the heck it was against Putin, barely anybody, lifted a finger to defend Putin, right? So he had to be really, really concerned about first PLA loyalties. Probably one of the things that's driving all those, the purge that's going on within the PLA right now. And then he had to be really, really concerned about the depth of support, not just the breadth of support, but the depth of support for the public for an actual Taiwan invasion. So that's also driving a lot of Xi's own domestic politics when he's trying to make everything ideological, because he sort of wants his own populace to not just accept an idea of an invasion, but to be openly supportive of even a long confrontation. And that's something that's probably been troubling him a lot with this Russia-Ukraine war.
As we have a few more minutes, I want to ask two questions that are related to each other from the advisor seat. We always do that in our simulations. What would you, Madam Sir President, do? Kind of questions. So those two questions are the following. And the first one is, if you had to give an advice to the new government in Taiwan of the best thing they can do in order to improve their cross-strait relations with China, what would be that advice? And the second question is, what would be the thing to avoid, i.e., would be the worst thing they could do in order to harm the relations with China?
Excellent. All right. So for Lai's new administration, there is a real block there simply because the party will not talk to Lai. So without any real dialogue between the two parties, there's very few positive things that Lai could get out of even trying to talk with with a party, let alone with Xi. So it's really more about the deterrent messaging that Lai can bring to the table. First is trusting his initial instincts in that making waves is bad for Taiwan, right? So nothing really earth-shattering. Make it an extremely boring inauguration speech, right? And then that way, that'll give the party much less of an excuse to do something really big, right? And then, second of all, and much more importantly, is really getting Taiwan's own military deterrence house in order. And that means speeding up two things. And the first thing is speeding up the reform of the Taiwan military, which has been ongoing, relatively slow, but ongoing, speed that up. And the second thing would be to really look at the integration of the popular will into Taiwan's defense. So Taiwan's civilian defense. That's always been a really thorny topic, and it's something that Taiwan has not fully decided on. What it would like its own civilians to do in case of an emergency. But that type of civilian resistance is critical, not just to pure warfighting aspects, but to the message that it sends to the CCP, knowing that the populace is willing to defend Taiwan, to the very end. That has a deterrent effect, and that's something that really must be explored.
Are there any down the road potential events or clash points that you see? You talked a little bit about the potential escalation in regards to the spike of upcoming incursions that we're likely going to see. Do you see any more potential such events or I would say actions that are likely to take place down the road that will reflect of an escalation or a de-escalation?
Yes. So there's always been the issue of potential, military mishaps, right? That's one of the things that the U.S. is really concerned about. They have a whole mechanism with the PLA, the Military Consultative Agreement or talks, really to try to see if there are any ways to sort of make the operational issues of two militaries being in relatively close contact work, right? It's not something that the PLA really likes to discuss with the U.S., but there is that mechanism there. And for the most part, we know that if the PLA is being more dangerous with a U.S. military vessel, is precisely to send some sort of messaging to the U.S. Now, there's nothing, of course, like that with Taiwan. So there's always a threat that there's going to be some sort of mishap between Taiwan and the PRC, and there's just no buffer there at all whatsoever, and that would cause a crisis. So that's always been an issue that's foremost as a critical area where there could be a crisis. Might also be a reason why the PRC is exploring the use of mass balloons as well, simply because there's less potential there for a major crisis to happen if something were to go wrong.
So as we're reaching the final minutes of our webinar here, I would like to ask if you have any final kind of closing remarks that you would like to make about the topic, kind of a nice closing or an ending to this webinar.
Yeah, so the Taiwan elections, it's going to be very interesting to see that trilateral relationship, the U.S., Taiwan, China, really evolve over this year, simply because we've never seen China in such a relative state of weakness yet power. Again, we go back to this idea of paradoxes, right? Politically, Xi right now just can't afford much more on his plate. Yet he also has a tool that's stronger than ever, the PLA. and that tool will be sheltered from all the economic effects of this downturn. So yeah, we've seen a lot of commentary, especially from the US, about, is this peak China or not, right? And from the perspective of Taiwan, this is actually a relatively meaningless question simply because the power imbalance is so big, and it'll probably continue to get even bigger over the next few years despite this downturn. So it's really, again, all in the mind of just one person and how much he can be affected by the elections itself, by Taiwan's perceived will to fight and ability to fight, and that's more true than ever with this Lai administration, simply because there's really no other way for him to communicate other than to show that he has a really big stick, or at least a bigger stick than he used to.
Okay, and that's the closing remarks for this session. Eric, again, thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank everybody
Thank
who
you.
joined us today as well. Uh, as earlier discussed, there will be a recording posted via our channels, social media channels, YouTube, and on our website and the blog. So we welcome you to log in to watch it. In addition, I wish to welcome everybody to stay tuned to us to more webinars we're going to be conducting. This is the second one this year. We're going to have a few more coming up the next few months. So Eric and everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.